RoadGlideSully checking in from the once independent Lone Star State of Texas. Forewarning, this video is likely to be long, but I think if you stick around, you may learn something. Lord knows I have in putting it together. And you might actually figure out how to use the conditions that you set up inside your tobacco cellar to your advantage. So a while back I did a video, and I'm going to do a recap of that video. You can go watch the original. It's called Cellar Management. I'll put a link down in the crankcase. So I want to do a recap of that video, and then I also want to talk about controlling the variables in our cellar. I'm going to talk a little bit about why, or what the research shows. What does the research tell us? I'm going to talk about why it matters. Why does it matter, the condition of your cellar? And then I'm also going to talk about the variables, specifically fermentation variables, variables that we might be able to control to our advantage, and specifically the advantage of our tobacco, that we are going to wait a long time to figure out whether or not it's a good condition or not. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about an experiment that me and 4 other YTPC members are going to conduct over the next year. So first of all, a recap of the original video. So the original video that I did talked mostly about how to kind of manage your cellar. And what does that mean? That means how you can kind of take control of the tobaccos that you're putting in your cellar, so that when it reaches time to smoke them, you have the tobaccos that you like. I actually got a lot of feedback from that video, a lot of comments, a lot of folks talking about the different ways that they manage their cellar, some on purpose and some kind of inadvertently just rolling with the punches, which is how I've done up to this point. So Cherry on Top said, great video. There's a reason I've been smoking the same 4 blends 95% of the time for the last 18 years. Yet I have shelves and bins full of probably 50 different blends. It's the long game, baby. I'm at the point where basically my tobacco cellar pays for itself. And my pipe collecting, right? So not only is he paying for his tobacco, he's paying for his pipes by selling the tobaccos that he has in his cellar. I called that the tobacco stock market, right? So that's one of the advantages of planning now is that you might actually be able to save up enough money later to be able to buy things that you're right now having to come out of pocket. I got another piece of feedback, and I'll let you guys go back and read all the comments, but I would suggest you do, because there's some interesting tidbits of information. But I got one comment from Cal Delta Piper, and in his comment he said, maybe you can help me with a question, Sully. He said, I'm trying to find information about cellaring tobacco in a cabinet in my garage, in tins and in mason jars, and he hasn't found any clear-cut answers. What are your thoughts? I thought that was an interesting question, because I too have thought that same thing. In fact, my active cellars right now, I have half of my tobacco in my garage, and I have half of my tobacco in my bedroom closet. Now, why would I do that? Well, because I don't know the answer to that question, and I too have tried to find the answer and have come up equally as short as Cal Delta had. So I want to talk a little bit about what the research shows on this topic. So I've looked quite a bit for scholarly articles, etc. And I haven't been able to find a whole hell of a lot, to be honest. The articles that I have found were articles from the 1950s and some articles from China. I think that's interesting because China itself has been historically communist, but is shifting over the last couple of decades slowly towards a more capitalistic society. Well, what does that mean? That means that they are a little bit more into competitive advantage. And why is that important? Well, the conclusion that I've drawn from the fact that most of those articles are from the 1950s and or from China is that U.S. research is held on too tight because tobacco companies in the U.S. or other countries for that matter, they realize that the process through which they ferment or age their tobacco prior to it getting in the tin potentially creates a competitive advantage. And so they don't want all of their own scientific discoveries to get out. And the reason that I think that's true is that most recent articles are from China, where there was less concern about competitive advantage. In a communist party, there's less concern. It's not a capitalist environment where competitive advantage really increases a company's ability to make profits. So, well, what does that mean? I think that means that we're kind of on our own to some extent. And while it would be nice to be able to read a paper and figure out exactly, what we should do, we can't always do that in a lot of cases. So that leads us down to figuring out, well, how do we control the various things that we can control? So the next question is well, why does it matter? Why would we want to control those variables? For me, it's all about the end result. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that, because as you know, or if you've watched my channel, you may not know, but you're about to. I used to be a beer brewer, award-winning beer brewer. And there's a lot of science that is surrounding how to brew beer, how to use different variables to your advantage in the brewing process so that you can achieve results that are whatever you desire. It goes with bookends, right? There's only so much you can control, and there is so much the variables will have an influence on the end result. But you can make a difference in that process. If you've ever had a home brewer's bad beer, you know that they didn't control the variables. If you've ever had an award-winning home brew, you know that they did. So I'm going to draw a parallel between fermentation and brewing and fermentation in tobacco, and it's probably not 100% accurate parallel, but it's the experience that I drew on to get to the experiment that I want to do. So in beer brewing, there are certain variables that we can control. Oxygen levels is an example. Well, how do we control that? Well, beer fermentation goes through two different fermentations, and this may sound familiar to you if you're familiar with the process that tobacco goes through. So when you first brew a beer, you inject oxygen into it, usually using porous stone and pure oxygen. The reason you do that is because you want that fermentation to start off as what's called an aerobic fermentation. What does aerobic mean? That means there's oxygen present. And then once all that tobacco, I got tobacco on the brain. Once all of that oxygen is depleted, then that fermentation will continue in what's called an anaerobic condition. And that means there's no oxygen present. The reason that's important is because the yeast and the bacteria, they behave differently depending on what environment they're in. And so we try to control that environment so that we can get the best results out of our yeast and out of our bacteria that's in that wort. The other variable, or another variable, is temperature. When I brewed beer, I had a fermentation chamber. And in that fermentation chamber, I could control the temperature based on the temperature of the wort. The advantage that that gave me is I could keep a constant temperature throughout the entire fermentation. Or I could vary the temperature throughout the fermentation to achieve different results. And finally, the last variable in beer brewing is the things to ferment. What are we going to ferment? In beer brewing, it's sugar. It's sugar and other ingredients that yeast and bacteria will feed on. And the result in brewing is alcohol. But there's a parallel, I believe, between tobacco fermentation and beer brewing. I think the variables that we can control are fairly similar. So we know in tobacco, we could, in our cellars, control the oxygen levels. You ask how we do that. Well, let's use Samuel Gawith and Cornell and Deal as two good examples. Cornell and Deal, when they seal their tobacco tins, they do not vacuum seal them. They cap them, they seal them, but that means that all of the oxygen, easy for me to say, all of the oxygen that's going to be inside that tin is in that tin when it's sealed. That means over time, that tobacco potentially could go through both an anaerobic and an aerobic fermentation. Right? First the aerobic, because oxygen's there, and then once the oxygen is depleted, it would be an anaerobic, which means different bacteria that's in that tobacco could do different things during both of those two cycles. Whereas Samuel Gawith, they vacuum seal their tins, which means they deplete as much of the oxygen as they can in their tins. Now, there's probably still some oxygen left, but it's a lot less than what's in Cornell and Deal tins. And so if you're familiar with those kind of tins, I wish I had one with me, but if you're familiar with those kind of tins, you'll know the difference in what I'm talking about. If not, just do a Google search and you'll see the difference between the two. So they try to deplete the oxygen so that it's predominantly an anaerobic fermentation. Well, what does that tell you? That tells me that they probably know that there's a difference in the end result in some fashion or another. That's why one company chooses to do it one way, another company chooses to do it the other. So we can control that environment variable in our own cellars. And I'll tell you a little bit about how we're going to do that later. We can also control temperature. The question that Cal Delta asked was, is it okay to keep it in my garage? Well, translate that into, is it okay to keep your cellar in a place that could have potentially wide temperature swings? So my garage in Texas will go anywhere between probably the 40s all the way up to mid 90s, if not higher. That means it's going to be a wide array of temperatures throughout the year. While this is good in some environments, we don't know if it's good in tobacco environments. But we can control it, which is why I said I'm already trying to control that based on and I'm hedging my bets. Half of my tobacco's in one place, half of my tobacco's in the other. But wouldn't it be nice if I knew the difference? And I knew exactly where it needed to be. So there's other variables that we cannot directly control. And that is, if you remember back to the beer brewing one, is we can't really control the things to ferment. That's going to be controlled by predominantly the manufacturer of the tobacco. It'll be dependent on the genre that we pick and the blend characteristics, meaning toppings, no toppings, etc. So while we can't control those things, we can select tobaccos for an experiment. We can select tobaccos that kind of fit all of those things. So as I started thinking through this, I started realizing that I cannot do this experiment on my own. I need help. I could, but it'd get really expensive because, you know, I'd have to try to create as many groups as possible to hit all of those different variables that we're going to try to control in an experiment. So I solicited some help, and I'll tell you who I solicited it from in just a moment. But I did decide that I wanted to do an experiment. I want to find out how those variables will impact my cellar long term, or at least be a little bit more educated on how they might. I don't think this experiment's going to be definitive. I don't think any experiment we're going to do is going to be definitive, but at least it'll get me down the path of knowing a little bit more about how much risk I'm putting in my cellar by keeping it in my garage versus in my bedroom closet. So the objectives of the experiment: I want to find out what effects we can have on the tobacco aging process. Do they have an impact on the end result? Right? We hear that they do, we're told that they do, but I'm a kind of guy that likes to know why and what, right? I don't think I'm going to find out exactly why, but I can at least find out exactly what, or get closer than I am today. We also want to figure out what characteristics our own optimal cellars should have. And again, I've said this in my last video, but preference of the end result is subjective. It's independent per person. It's your own preference, right? So it's based on our own preference of what the end result should be. Well, that means it's very subjective. I might like a tobacco right out of the tin more than I like it after it's been aged a year. I don't know the answer to that, but what I am trying to figure out is what are the optimal conditions, right, that I need to have for my cellar to get the end result, potentially even the optimal conditions based on all of those variables and the genres, right? You follow me? So I've solicited the help of 4 other YTPC members. So in this experiment, it's going to be myself, RoadGlideSully, Four-Eyed Piper, Zach, Lester Skinner, PT Daily, Drew, and Road King Piper, Eric. And we've all decided to do this experiment together. What are we going to do? Well, we're going to try as best as we can to control both aerobic and anaerobic fermentations, the temperature, and the genre of tobacco, meaning Virginia, English, aromatic, etc. Well, how we're going to control those, or I like to use the term control a lot, but really what I'm saying is influence, right? So how are we going to control or influence those variables? Well, each of us is going to have 3 tins or 2 ounce equivalent batches of tobacco. And the 3 ways that we're going to store those tobacco are vacuum sealed, either already in the tin or using a vacuum sealer, which I know everybody says to don't do, but if we want an anaerobic condition, we need to do it. We're going to use a sealed 8-ounce mason jar. Right, so if we're using tinned tobacco, we'll open the tin, we'll put the contents in an 8-ounce mason jar, and we'll seal it, and that'll remain sealed. And then finally, we're going to have another 8-ounce mason jar that will continually be introducing oxygen into. So that's going to be our aerobic fermentation, right? So if you follow me, we'll have a anaerobic environment, we'll have an aerobic then anaerobic environment, and then we'll have a almost entirely aerobic environment. So those are all 3 different ways that we can control the fermentation of our cellar. At least 1 type of tobacco will be selected per person. I'm probably going to do 2. I think Zach might do 2, but I think everybody else is going to do 1. And then we're going to age all 3 of those samples for 1 year. We're going to start on May 1st of 2019. So to recap, 3 tins and or 2-ounce batches of tobacco, 3 different environments, anaerobic, aerobic, then anaerobic in one jar, and then finally aerobic. And we're going to probably open those tins for the aerobic ones, I'm going to guess once every 2 weeks, just to make sure that we have an ample supply of oxygen. We're going to do that for a 1-year period. Once we're done, after that 1-year period, we're going to break each tin down into samples so that everybody in our experiment group can try them. We're going to try our best to measure our findings. So when we sample the tobaccos that come out of that experiment, we're going to try to follow a kind of a standard template for reviewing each one of those tobaccos. And that standard template is we're going to take notes on appearance, on aroma, on our char lights, the first half of the bowl and the second half of the bowl. And what we'll also have is something I haven't mentioned, which is a fourth sample. And that sample will be basically our control group, or a brand new tin of whatever it is we're aging, so that we can actually tell the differences between and have something to compare it to. So that's the experiment that we're going to do, right? Like I said, we're just trying to figure out how many variables we can control, how much of the process can we control, so that we can achieve our end results. I don't know which one I'm going to like yet, but my hope is that I'll figure that out as a result of this experiment, or at least get closer, so that I can set those conditions up for whatever genre of tobacco I am cellaring. So, how can you guys participate? I hope you do. I hope that you also do this experiment along with us. How can you do that? Well, you can find 3 to 5 participants to do it with you. And the reason you don't want to grow that big beyond that is because you're going to have to break these samples down so that everybody can try all the tobaccos. You can do the exact same experiment. And if you decide to do this, even if you want to do it by yourself, let me know. Send me an email at RoadGlideSully@gmail.com so that I'm aware that you're doing the experiment. What I will likely do is set up a 2-week reminder, because there is going to be active management of at least the jar, the aerobic jar, which means we're going to have to pull the lids off once every 2 weeks to make sure that there's ample supply of oxygen. And then what I'll ask you to do is share your results, not necessarily the tobacco, but your findings. What did you like the best, right? So if you want to do it by yourself, feel free. Pick as many genres as you're comfortable having 3 tins of sit in your cellar, and you can do it by yourself. Take your own notes and share your results, either through a video eventually, and more to come on that, obviously. It's going to be a long experiment. And then most importantly, have fun. That's why I think it's best to do it with other people, because you can talk about it, you can brainstorm, and especially once you get to do the samples, you can talk about the results and see if there's folks that maybe had a different perception of something than you did, and I think that'll be rather interesting once we finish this. So I knew it was going to be a long video, but like I said, I hope you stuck around for the experiment. I'm going to leave this video up. I'll probably pin it to my channel so that people can continue to come back and refer to it and find it very easily by just going to RoadGlideSully.com. By the way, if you go to RoadGlideSully.com, it'll go straight to my It'll go straight to my YouTube channel, the main page. So I'm going to try to make this video as easy to find as possible so that we can all do this experiment together. So that's all I got. Let me know if you have any questions, or if you have ideas, especially before May 1st, before we actually get started. If you have ideas on maybe how to make it better, or suggestions, or maybe tweaks that you're going to make in your experiment, let me know down in the crankcase. Leave a comment, and hopefully we can all share our ideas together. So until the next time, I'll probably do another video that'll be the kickoff video on May 1st. or sometime in that area, so that just to remind everybody that we're getting ready to start, and we will go from there. We're in it for the long haul, folks. And I'm sorry, I told you we was going to get nerdy, but I have too many questions. So hopefully you guys will answer those questions with me. Until then, I'm RoadGlideSully. Keep the rubber side down.